Welcome to ForexTV.com. Today's Wednesday, July 23rd. I'm Remy Hookey for New York Forex Market Buzz. The U.S. dollar is higher against the euro, yen, and Aussie, but back down against the pound at the $2 handle. And taking a quick look at the latest headlines from the CEP News Desk, the key news events of the morning included a significant drop in crude oil supplies in the U.S. and the higher than expected June CPI inflation reading in Canada. Canada's headline inflation rate jumped 3.1% in June, largely the result of rising fuel prices. The core CPI rose 1.5% in June. And in the U.S., crude oil inventories declined further than expected in the week ending July 18th, falling by 1.558 million barrels. And meanwhile, the National Hurricane Center reported that Dolly has strengthened to a Category 2 hurricane. Hurricane warnings remain in effect for the coast of Texas from Brownsville to Corpus Christi, as well as for the northeastern coast of Mexico. And in the U.S. today, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson said that an agreement reached Tuesday on a housing rescue bill will send a strong message to investors and help the U.S. turn the corner on the housing crisis. And in overnight news, the Bank of England released the minutes of its July 9th and 10th MPC meeting and reported that 7 members voted to keep the bank rate unchanged at 5%. 2 members voted for a change in the rate. Meanwhile, the Australian Bureau of Statistics announced that Australia's CPI was 1.5% in the June quarter of 2008 compared with a 1.3% rise in the March quarter. This resulted in a total rise of 4.5% through the year to the June quarter of 2008. This afternoon, I'm joined by George Davis, Chief FX Technical Analyst at RBC Capital Markets. Good afternoon, George.
Good afternoon, Remy.
Thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure for being here.
Well, in today's session, we're seeing the dollar advance against the majors with the exception of cable. In early New York trade yesterday, the dollar gained sharply versus the majors, and the dollar is managing to hold on to gains against the euro, Aussie, and yen. So let's start out with a look at euro dollar. Now, looking at the hourly charts, the pair fell below the 157 level and is currently off session lows. But given the euro decline in the past 24 hours against the dollar, what is your near-term forecast and recommendation?
Well, in terms of the near-term prognosis for the euro, I think based on the price action that we saw yesterday, we're likely to see some additional downside for the euro against the U.S. dollar. Yesterday, we basically broke below a short-term support trend line at 158.45, and I think that's going to keep the short-term bias to the downside with the next significant support level coming in at 156.13. So I think that 158.45 level now will attract short-term selling interest, and I think we're setting up for a move down towards the 156.13 area as we move into the end of this week.
Well, George, now that we've covered euro dollar, I do want to look at some of the crosses. So let's look at the euro crosses of euro yen and euro sterling. Now, after hitting another record high late in the Tokyo session, euro yen has pulled back. And for euro sterling, the multi-week triangle support has been broken. So what is your short-term forecast for these euro crosses?
Well, in terms of looking at the euro-yen chart right now, the one interesting thing I think that stands out the most is we're currently looking to basically break above the prior high that we set about a week and a half to 2 weeks ago. And that would be a very, very bullish signal if we're able to sort of take out that 169.05 area. We're currently just trading above there. So if we manage to close above 169.05, I think that would be a fairly bullish signal for the euro against the yen. And I think the risk would be for some additional gains up towards the 171, 172 area. So it does look like the uptrend in euro-yen is about to continue, and we now have support basically coming in around the 167.80 area, with that level expected to attract some buying interest. In terms of the euro against the pound sterling, we have seen a dramatic rise in the euro versus the pound, and I think right now that rally is getting a little bit stretched from a valuation standpoint. So I think the 80 cent level is going to be tough to break right now, and I think we're more than likely to get at least a valuation-driven correction that takes us back down towards the 76.50 area. So I think that the bias for euro sterling right now would be to the downside as a correction is expected to unfold.
Well, George, while we're still looking at the UK currency, let's also take a look at cable against the US dollar. Now, cable is not extending a weakness against the dollar from yesterday's session, and on the heels of the latest BoE minutes, do you see sterling gains being short-lived? And what are your short-term levels for cable against the dollar?
Well, we've seen quite a bit of volatility in the pound sterling against the U.S. dollar over the last 3 trading days. Basically, on Monday we had a nice rally. Yesterday we had a sharp sell-off, and now today we're seeing some gains again, retracing yesterday's losses. So I think from a technical standpoint, the market is still fairly neutral at this juncture. And I do think that moves to the top side are likely to be limited in the sense that we have some resistance that comes in basically up against the 201.34 level. So I think up around the 201, 201.30 area, we're likely to run into some selling pressure for the pound. And then on the downside, I think eventually we are going to see a move towards trendline support at 198.20. And I think the key variable to keep an eye on there is numbers that come out in the UK that pertain to growth, because what we're starting to see now is a slowdown in the real estate sector in the UK, and if that starts to spread out and starts to have a deeper impact in terms of slowing down consumers' buying habits, in terms of what that means for retail sales, for example, that I think would likely generate some additional downside pressure on the pound sterling.
Okay, Georgia, and indeed we will be getting UK retail sales data as well as Q2 GDP data later this week. Now, moving on to the commodity currency of the Aussie dollar, we've been seeing plenty of volatility in commodity prices, especially crude oil and gold. And the Aussie has extended losses against the dollar from yesterday's session. So if you could briefly give us your fundamental outlook for Aussie and also your short-term strategy for Aussie dollar.
Sure. In terms of the Aussie, I mean, a lot of the price action, obviously, for the commodity currencies, the Australian dollar, the New Zealand dollar, and the Canadian dollar in particular, has been driven by the price moves that we've seen in crude oil of late. And with crude oil peaking and coming off over the last week and a half or so, we've seen similar price action have a negative impact on the Australian dollar. And I think that is likely to be the driver as we go forward. And I think Australia, from a fundamental standpoint, is dealing with the same issues that a lot of the central banks are dealing with, in the sense that we're starting to see some evidence of a slowdown in growth, but at the same time we're starting to see a build-up in inflation pressures. And certainly that's the case in Australia as well. And I do think that at least over the shorter term, it's likely to be the price action in commodity markets that determines how the Australian dollar does. And I think the bias is still to the downside in terms of crude oil. So I wouldn't be surprised with respect to that we see the Australian dollar move down towards the 95-cent level. So we could see basically another cent and a half of downside risk based on what's going on in commodity markets right now.
Okay, George, we're all out of time for today's interview. Thank you very much for your insight and analysis into the Forex marketplace.
You're very welcome.
This has been your Forex Market Buzz with George Davis from RBC Capital Markets. I'm Remy Hoki. Join us later this afternoon, 4 p.m. exchange, right here on ForexTV.com.